Good morning, everybody. This is the next lecture in the ongoing COVID-19 lecture series while we are conducting our class online rather than face-to-face. I'm Adam Elwanger. These lectures are for my English 5317 course at the University of Houston downtown. And our topic has been rhetorical theory this semester. We just finished doing work on Nietzsche, on Saussure, on Bakhtin, and so we're very quickly moving into modern texts and rhetoric. And today I want to have a look at Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s text on the Signifying Monkey. We're working again from the excerpt in the rhetorical tradition by Bezel and Herzberg. You might know Henry Louis Gates Jr. even if you don't know his work. He is the host of a show on PBS. I can't remember the name of that show, but it's one where people sort of look at their DNA and their ancestry and that sort of thing, and he hosts that. He's also fairly well known for what during the Obama administration was called the Beer Summit. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was harassed by a police officer who thought he was breaking and entering into his own house when he was on the campus of his university. Barack Obama had some comments about that and ultimately invited the police officer and Gates to the White House to have a beer and sort things out and squash the proverbial beef. So anyways, he's a public figure in contemporary United States, but he's also a major figure in critical theory, linguistics, language, and rhetoric. Before we get into the specifics of the text here, I want to recall some of the concepts that we saw in Saussure, because I think that Gates is explicitly responding to a Saussurean view of linguistics. So when Saussure, in Course on General Linguistics, discusses how language works, he says that it works through signs, and that signs are the unification of a signifier and a signified. And you will recall that for Saussure, right, the signified is the concept, the thing out in the world. The signifier is the word, which he calls a sound image, because the sound of the word calls up an image in our minds that links up with that real world concept, the signified. And the result of this dynamic of signification is meaning, right? But we also have to remember that Saussure draws our attention to the fact that we never really get to the signified, that language can never unveil to us the unmediated truth of reality, because ultimately all systems of language, writing, speaking, right, all these are forms of representation of something that exists outside of the medium of language itself. And so that's a kind of deferral, right? A deferral that we never really get to the signified through the process of language. We can only represent the signified. All right, so at the top of my little board here it says Gates on Black, Rhetorical, Deferrance. Yes, I know that's misspelled, right? It's a term that Gates uses to underscore this notion of deferral. Deferral and difference, right? It's a combination of deferral and difference. And he's very interested in the deferral that Black language use makes use of, and he's interested in how Black uses of rhetoric are different. So, deference, deferral and difference. Okay? All right. So, there's a brief review of Saussure. Gates starts out by contrasting what he says is Black signification with a capital S and white little s signification signification. So he says, look, there's this white concept of signification, which he's going to refer to with a lowercase s, and he's going to contrast this with the black mode of signification, which he gives a capital S. Now, he sees in this conflict over meaning, and how meaning will be constructed, and how the politics of meaning will be structured, right? In that conflict over this, he sees the conflict between white and black culture in the United States and other nations writ large, right? And so he sees this as a struggle between black culture and white culture over how meaning itself will be constituted and will be made to work through language. Okay? So, let's start on 1553. On page 1553, he talks about other black reinventions of language. And he says that what black people have done with the concept of signification is reinvent a white concept, right? They've taken this traditional notion of signification and made it their own. He says on 1553 that black Americans have done this with a whole lot of terms that come from sort of white language, right? But he thinks that this particular reinvention, the reinvention of signification itself, is especially meaningful. So let's look at the passage in the second column on 1553. He says, this political offensive, by political offensive he means this reinvention of this concept, could have been mounted against all sorts of standard English terms, and indeed it was. I'm thinking here of terms such as down, N-word, baby, and cool, which snobbishly tend to be written about as dialect words or slang. There are scores of such revised words, but to revise the term signification is to select a term that represents the nature of the process of meaning creation and its representation. Few other selections could have been so dramatic or so meaningful. We are witnessing here a profound disruption at the level of the signifier. Drop down a few lines, he says, to revise the received sign literally accounted for in the relation represented by signifier signified at its most apparently denotative level is to critique the nature of white meaning itself, to challenge through a literal critique of the sign the meaning of meaning itself. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. He says, look, lots of words have been reinvented by black culture. Like take cool for an example, right? And traditionally in sort of white language use, that just means not cold, but cool. Not warm or hot, not cold, not quite cold, but cool, right? And he says, you know, that black language use has made that meaning or that word mean something much different. Okay. Down is another example. Like if somebody says, "Hey, would you like to go to the store with me?" and you say, "Yeah, I'm down," right? But down literally means just down, right? But it's taken on some different meaning, Gates argues, through black linguistic practice or praxis. Okay. So he says that, yeah, we've reinvented lots of words, right? But this one is especially important precisely because it is a reinvention of how language means itself. And we'll get into that a little more as we go along here. Okay? So let's look at 1554 then, because here we see he tells us what he means by signifying, right? And it's important that we mention, right, that with the G in the white traditional mode of signifying, what signifying is to mean something. If we say, what does this signify, right? We're asking, what does this mean? What does the thing represent? What does it signify, right? But Gates is playing off of a black tradition of signifying, right? Which he says is fundamentally an attack on this notion of meaning that operates in white discourse, okay? So let's read where he talks about signifying. This is on page 1554. he says, accordingly, if in standard English signification equals the signifier over the signified, right, or the unity of the concept and the sound image, then in the Black vernacular, signification is the unification of rhetorical figures and the signifier, right? In other words, the relation of signification itself has been critiqued by a Black act of redoubling. The Black term of signifying, right, has as its associated concept all of the rhetorical figures subsumed in the term signify. Okay? Now, he continues, he says, to signify, in other words, is to engage in certain rhetorical games. All right. So, he says that signifying is engaging in certain types of rhetorical games. And he's talking here about things like doing the dozens, right? Yo mama jokes, rap, insults, right? What different modes of what might traditionally be viewed as Black street talk. And it's important to understand here that Gates's larger project is to say that, well, traditionally Black modes of speech in America have been marginalized and viewed as unsophisticated or undeserving of serious intellectual consideration. What Gates is getting ready to do is to show us that, in contrast to that view, first of all, there are very complex rhetorical phenomena at work in Black American speech, right? And further, he wants to recover the scholarly value, the intellectual value, and the cultural importance of Black Americans in habitation of, the English language. Okay, so, in other words, if signifying is to play rhetorical games, then we're talking about that signifying is a technique, right? It's a techne. It's something you learn to do with words. All right. And he calls it a trope. In fact, on 1556, he says that, let me read the passage here. He says, this is in the second column on 1556. He says, I'm not interested in either recapitulating or contributing to this highly specialized debate over whether or not Speech Act X is an example of this particular Black trope or that one. On the contrary, I want to argue that signifying is the Black trope of tropes, the figure for Black rhetorical figures. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what that means. We've talked in class about the figures of speech, right? The figures of speech as basically recurring formulaic strategies for enhancing the power of speech or writing. That's what rhetorical figures are, right? So if you can use a metaphor, right? Metaphor is a figure of speech, right? And usually when we speak in metaphors, often our language becomes more compelling, right? So it amplifies, the figure amplifies the power of our discourse. And of course, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of figures of speech that we could talk about. These figures of speech, though, as you remember, are divided into two major categories: tropes and schemes, right? And so schemes are figures that tend to relate to the organization or structure of a given utterance or sentence. Like, say, ask not what your country could do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? It's a flip, right? And so it's a scheme. And other figures of that type that do an inversion or a repetition or something like I came, I saw, I conquered. These are schemes, okay? A trope is different. A trope is a play on the meaning of a word, right? Or the sound of a word, or a set of words, you know. And so, Gates says that signifying is the trope of tropes for Black speech, right? He says that it is the figure of Black rhetorical figures. And what he's saying is, when we're talking about signifying, we're not just talking about one type of Black speech. Rather, signifying is the category that all different types of black linguistic play, linguistic games, falls under this category of signifying. Okay? And so now we've set the ground for the Signifying Monkey, which of course he's very interested in. And he points to these stories of the Signifying Monkey in African folklore and African American folklore. Okay? And we won't get into the specific origins of those stories, right? But they generally go something like this, right? We have three characters: the monkey, the lion, and the elephant. And the monkey is the signifier, the guy, the animal up in the tree, right? Who's joking around, who's playing. He's a monkey. He's playing, right? And then we have the elephant and the lion. Well, the monkey hates the lion, right? So the monkey says, "Hey, lion, I heard elephant," right? The elephant was saying some awful things about you, right? And he gets the lion all worked up. He's playing with the lion, right? And I don't mean like in a friendly way. I mean, maybe the more proper term would be he is playing the lion. He's playing him. So he gets the lion all worked up, thinking that the elephant has said some awful things about him. Well, the lion runs off and, challenges the elephant, insists he apologizes. Elephant says no and beats the lion up, right? And that's what the monkey wanted all along, right? So he achieves his goal, right? And then the lion comes back, right, to the monkey all beaten up and humbled and says, "Hey, you tricked me. As soon as you fall out of that tree, I'm going to get you," right? And really the story is that the monkey, through sophisticated uses of language, rhetoric, through rhetorical games, keeps eluding the lion's grasp and finding further ways to punish the lion, when in fact the monkey is the weaker of the two animals. Okay? So, why is Gates interested in these stories? Well, the main reason he's interested in them is that he thinks that it dramatizes some truth about the position of blacks in Western society, right? But also about how blacks in Western society are forced to use language in some unique and sophisticated ways. So let's talk about it then. When we look from the Western perspective, the Saussurean perspective, at signification, what is the signifier? Well, the signifier is a word. It's a sound image. In other words, it's an abstract psychological concept, right? But read through the monkey tales, what is the signifier in Black American English? Well, the signifier isn't an abstract, psychological concept. Rather, the signifier is the speaker. Get it? Like, the signifier is the one who signifies, the one who plays these rhetorical games, right? And the monkey in the Signifying Monkey tales plays this role. He himself is the signifier, the one who plays the games and the tricks, okay? Now, what is the lion? The lion represents, of course, the king of the jungle, right? The most powerful entity that's there. And yet, in the monkey tales, the weaker animal, the monkey, which Gates would see as analogous to a marginalized culture like black culture in the United States or other Western societies, right, is able to sort of beat the king of the jungle. In this case, Gates would say, which is tantamount to sort of mainstream white American English language use or American English cultural values, right? And so that's what the lion represents, those empowered discourses. And yet, the monkey, the weaker, marginalized character, through sophisticated uses of rhetoric, is able to exert a lot of force on the lion. So what's the elephant? Well, what the elephant is the embodiment of rhetorical force. He is the effect of language use. The monkey makes it so that the lion gets all mad in order for the monkey to get beat up, right? What the elephant signifies or represents, right, is the consequences, the real world material effects of rhetorical play. All right? So, this is a big change here from traditional understandings of Saussurean linguistics, and it shows us that that speech isn't a kind of disembodied abstract concept as it often gets played out in Saussure, right? Rather, it is an embodied praxis, a technique, right? It's deployed by a speaker. That speaker is the signifier, the one who engages in the rhetorical games of signifying. All right, so one thing that's interesting here is, and this is why Gates appreciates these stories so much, is that it is the monkey's aim to confuse and to confound, right? If you're looking for a passage on this, it happens on 1558 in the left-hand column, right? But he talks about how the monkey's interest is not to make clear his meaning through his language use or expose truth. Rather, he lies, right? He dissembles, he jokes, he uses double meanings. In other words, his aim is not to get us from the signifier to the signified safe, right? Rather, his aim is to muddle up and confuse the signifiers. And what is interesting, where Gates really draws the distinction between sort of traditional white understandings of language use and Black American ones, is that in the traditional sort of white realm of discourse, this deferrance, the fact that we can... Sorry, that's my phone ringing. I'm going to go shut it off. And actually, that was one of my students calling me, so Karen, I'll get back to you in a few minutes. Where was I? Yes, right. In traditional white discourse, white language use, this fact that we can never get to the signified is sort of treated as unfortunate, as a melancholic part of reality, that language ultimately just can't get us there. In contrast, Gates suggests that Black Americans sort of revel in this indeterminacy, right? That they enhance it rather than seek to avoid it. So, and what the difference really here is between denotative and connotative uses of language, right? So denotation is what a word means, right? Connotation is what a word suggests, right? And so traditionally we could say that denotative considerations are largely linguistic considerations or grammatical considerations, things like that. Connotative uses of language tend to be more rhetorical in the traditional sense. And so, from Gates's perspective, what he's saying is that what white language use is totally fixated on is denotation. In other words, what does this mean? I want my language to be as specific as possible so that I can convey a particular signified content from me to my speaker. Gates says that Black language use is fundamentally connotative, right? And it is meant sometimes to have double meanings or to be dualistic, right? To have hidden meanings, right? This kind of thing. So let's elaborate that a little bit, right? So Black American language uses are connotative rather than denotative. Gates suggests that they value style over substance, which is to say that they value form over content. And finally, they elevate sound over meaning, right? So it's often, we see this in particular sometimes in rap, right? Where it's less important what the words mean together, or it's less important that the whole rap song gives a unified message than that the lyrics sound cool together, right? And so elevate sound over meaning, okay? Now, to get to why Gates thinks this developed, well, it's an interesting explanation that he offers. He says that this actually developed because of Blacks' need to adapt to a society that for centuries held very real threats for them, right? In a marginalized people who had previously been enslaved and were then discriminated against through legal segregation, right? A simple exchange with any given white person in a position of power could have very serious harmful consequences for a black individual. And so what Gates suggests is that really through navigating those situations, black Americans got very good at these very sophisticated uses of language that can mean two things at once, right? And some examples he gives of that are sort of slave spiritual songs, which the slave owners took to be expressions of their happiness. Oh, look, the slaves are singing. They must be loving this, right? Whereas in fact, what the songs were obviously was an expression of mourning and an expression of solidarity, among the slaves against their oppressors, right? And so Gates says that black Americans over centuries have learned very tactical, strategic uses of language that can mean different things to different audiences, and that they have a positive view of these types of language uses, in part because they recognize the way that type of language use has structured solidarity among their people, but also has enabled people of African descent to mitigate or navigate various harms that people of African descent might encounter in day-to-day life, and especially a society that's marked by segregation or slavery. It's ultimately a strategy for self-preservation, and it is a radically different view of this indeterminacy of meaning. So the black difference, rhetorically, if we want to say that from traditional white discourse, is that whereas white theories of language tend to lament or mourn the fact that we never get to the signified, right? Black uses of language are different in that they celebrate the deferral. They celebrate the ambiguity. They amplify the indeterminacy of language. Okay, now there's another consideration that we don't have to talk about now, but that is worthy of your consideration, right? Gates kind of vacillates on whether or not, right, this is actually something unique and different from the rhetorical tradition at large. For example, at the end of our excerpt here, he seems fairly eager to take sort of specific instances of signifying, right, and give them their traditional Latin or Greek names from rhetorical theory, right, which seems to ultimately say, perhaps there's really nothing new here at all, right? Certainly, I think the thing that he sees as new is not that they've developed new figures. It's rather the strategic ends to which the figures are devoted, and the recognition that indeterminacy doesn't have to be a deficiency in language use. It can actually be a benefit. All right, so that's it. I hope if you have questions, put them in the comment box. I'll try to answer them. I hope you're all well. Take it easy.